Okay, so let's start now. C'est beaucoup mieux, apparemment. Okay, so before going to the research question, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on environmental crime. So I will start with a very, very broad definition, and I will explain a little bit later why it is a very contested definition too, but just to give you some insight. So environmental crime, we could say that is all the illegal acts which directly and seriously harm the environment. So there's plenty of forms of environmental crime. Just to give you some examples here. Okay, we could think about all the debate about illegal fisheries, about the illegal logging in protected areas, about the illegal release of mercury from illegal mining into rivers, illegal trade in wildlife, illegal disposal of hazardous waste, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to give you many more examples because this is not an exhaustive list once again, but what is very interesting is the fact that you have the illegal term here, and that's also something that we will talk about today. What is very interesting with environmental crime is that now it has turned out to be a very contemporary issue. It's a growing political issue if you have a look on some national and international agendas. So here again, just some examples. So I had a look at the news from the last 2 months, and this is what happened regarding environmental crime. So in the US, I think it's in Puerto Rico and it's in Virgin Islands, there has been the creation of a dedicated task force just for environmental crime. And the same thing also happened in Austria with the dedicated task force that was created at the same time. So this is for the national agenda, but we could talk a bit more about that. There's also similar things going on in Brazil, for instance. There's also a lot of new sanctions that have been adopted in the US. So this is a national issue for sure. This is also something very international, and maybe you have already heard about it a little bit with the current debates about ecocide in Ukraine. And so we recognize that in Ukraine, Russia is committing a form of massive environmental crime through ecocide. So that's also a very important discussion, and there's a lot of debates about it. How can we explain that strong focus on environmental crime? There's 2 types of arguments that have been used to really frame this issue as a current problem. I'm not going to engage with the discussion with all these arguments, but this is the type of argument that is being used. The first one relates to is more of quantitative nature. If you have a look at some broad estimation, environmental crime, there's this broad annual estimated value of $259 billion of annual estimated value. This is very contested, but just once again to give you a little bit of background, and this is a data coming from Interpol and the United Nations Environmental Agency. A second type of argument that has been used is the fact that environmental crime seems to have very qualitative impact, and this relates to the multidimensional damages of environmental crime. It seems that environmental crime has some impacts on the environment itself. If you think about all the degradation of biodiversity, for instance, there's also a strong impact of environmental crime on human health. If you think about the contamination of water, of the soil, of the deterioration of air quality, for instance. Also, all this new data about the psychological impact too of environmental crime. Once again, if you think about eco-anxiety and things like that, this is also part of human health. Something that relates more to economy, if you have a loss of biodiversity, if you have a loss of fishing, for instance, this has a strong impact on the fishery industry. If you have a contamination, I don't know, of animals, of the water, you cannot use them anymore also to produce and to have all this money. And finally, there's also something that relates to security with this idea that environmental crime is connected to different forms of crime. So, for instance, you have some connections, and once again, this can be discussed, between drug trafficking and environmental crime that has been made by Interpol, for instance. You also have this idea that environmental crime has been used, or this money coming from environmental crime has been used also for all the conflicts and wars. So there's also this idea that you have this type of connection. So once again, this is all the arguments that have been used. Environmental crime is an emerging threat and a threat on many dimensions of everyday life. If we now move on to the EU, what is quite interesting with the case of the EU is that it's not immune to environmental crime. Environmental crime seems to be something very far away. We can think about, I don't know, the trafficking of horns in Africa. We can think about some wildlife trafficking also in Asia. But actually, Europe is also plays also very strong parts in environmental crime. If you have a look at some forms of environmental crime, you can see how Europe is also a region of origin of this form of crime. I don't know if you're familiar with the 2006 Ivory Coast toxic waste dump, the Probo Koala case. Does that ring a bell? No. Okay. This was a boat, so coming from the Netherlands, and with toxic waste, and it went until Ivory Coast to the port of Abidjan, and there it's put all this toxic waste directly in the soil, in the water of Abidjan, and there has been a lot of people who died following that, a lot of injured people too. So that was something quite big at that time. We can also think of Europe as a region of origin. If you think about glass eels, I don't know if it's also something that you have heard about. No, glass eels. It's right now there's a ban, so you cannot export glass eels from Europe outside of Europe. This is because it's an endangered type of fish. I guess it's part of the fish part. And right now there's a strong demand from Asian countries, mostly to breed these glass eels. So there's also lots of debates about that type of traffic. Europe is also a destination of environmental crime. If you think mostly about the import of protected wildlife and exotic flora, so for instance, for all the exotic pets, the lions, the snakes, the parrots, things like that. And also there's a lot of import of exotic wood, for instance, that has been illegally produced. And finally, if we adopt a less cross-border perspective, but if we really focus on what is happening just within Europe, we'll see that there's also a lot of national forms of environmental crime. So regarding, for instance, the illegal dump waste, that's a massive problem in many countries. And also some intra-EU crimes, just like with the case of the Erika oil spill, so that goes from France to supposed to get to Sicily, but unfortunately there was this massive shipwreck, and so all these oil spill on Brittany in France. So what is quite interesting is that it has been for some years now, the European Union has developed more and more tools to fight and to regulate environmental crime with this justification that there was something that was not done at the national level and that needed to be achieved at the EU level. So the EU really said that member states were not doing enough and that the EU should intervene to regulate environmental crime. And what is the most contemporary development in that respect is the revision that are happening right now of the EU directive on environmental crime. So that will be the topic of today. What is quite striking in the case of environmental crime, and that appears also quite clearly with the revision of this text, is how this form of crime is really at the crossroads of two main objectives of the European Union. The first one being the establishment of the area of freedom, security, and justice. And just for a quick recall, that's the second objective of the European Union now. And also all this new agenda on the Green Deal. So I think most of you are familiar with that, so I will not give you much more details on that, but we can talk about it a little bit later. So that's why with all this data and all these questions, I came up with this research question about the EU. And so does the EU have the potential to unmute? That's the topic of this seminar. So to unmute the victims of environmental crime and to better regulate it, especially if we think about the different levels of governance between member states and the European Union. Can the European Union achieve something that cannot be done at the national level to unmute the victims of environmental crime? That's another way to say this. Okay. Just to give you a little bit of insights on the content for today, so I will have three main sections. So in the first one, I will give you a bit of background on who are the victims of environmental crime and why it is so hard to regulate that form of crime. So focusing a little bit on green policing especially. Then I will move to the first version of the Environmental Crime Directive, ECD, and how the EU has tried in the first time to really have this new agenda, a new type of tool. And then I will move to the ongoing negotiations of that text, and I will not give you a lot of legal background. I'm not, that's not my expertise, but mostly to have some time to talk about the challenges and debates regarding that text. Okay. So let's move to the victims and why, what is so specific about environmental crime. What is quite interesting is that environmental crime is seen as a victimless crime. So it's seen that first that we have some illegal activities, but they don't have any impact on anyone. And what is quite interesting is that you have more and more scholars who have really focused on discovering who these victims are. And so it's quite critical, but I think that's very interesting, the way you can use different critical perspectives to think also about environmental crime. So a first group of scholars has been quite strong on the anthropocentrism. I hope it's the appropriate way to say it in English. And this idea that the way we think about environmental crime is too human-oriented. That's the idea behind. And so we only think about human beings, we only think about the interests of human beings as a different species, but we forget all the environmental part. We forget that the first victims of this type of crime are animals, they are trees, they are plants, they are the environment itself, but they cannot speak. So that's the main issue. Other perspectival works have shed light on what is called environmental racism. So the fact that ethnic and racial minorities are the ones who are the most directly impacted also by this form of crime. So you have different academic works that have been produced on that topic. And so, for instance, in the US, this is the work I quote here. In the US, you have some racial minorities living closer to some illegal dump waste. And so they are most affected, they are most vulnerable to this form of crime with less control too. And so we have that these minorities will have also less vocal. And so that's also part of the muting process regarding environmental crime. A third critical perspective would be ecofeminism, the way we can think about feminism and environment at the same time. And so the way the exploitation of women can be compared to the exploitation of nature. And this is something that, for instance, this scholar Solon does when they study the wildlife trafficking in Norway, and they explain how environmental the ones who perpetrate environmental crime, they are mostly men. That's also part of a lot of very masculine rituals. If you think about adulthood, they connected in some culture with the hunting, with the killing of animals. So there's really this connection between the exploitation of women and nature, and that type of thinking that I think also very fascinating. And finally, you can also think about how many victims of environmental crime are just unknown. We don't know yet that they are victims. It could be due to many different things. It could be because some forms of environmental crime are just invisible. We don't know their effects yet. If you think about some disease that just developed over time, for instance, if you think that we don't have the sufficient tools also to capture, to detect environmental crime, for instance. And we can also think about the uncertainty of environmental crime, the way some illegal activities and harmful activities that are perpetrated today, the way they're going to impact the future generations, but we don't know it yet. So, of course, also these people, whether they are born or not, they don't have a strong word. They're not very vocal, so they are also part of this muting process. All clear now? Yeah? Okay. So let's move now to some of the specificities of environmental crime, and especially how it is difficult to regulate that form of crime. So is it mission impossible, yes or not? There's plenty of difficulties with the regulation of environmental crime. The first one is how contested the definition of this form of crime is. Remember in the first slide, there was all this list of illegal activities. And for some people, especially some scholars coming from the green criminology tradition, they decided that we have plenty of activities that are lawful but are still awful, that are harmful to the environment, but still they are legal. And that's a strong difficulty with environmental crime, because it's hard to also define clearly the boundaries of what is legal, what is illegal, especially because most of the time you have a connection between the licit and illicit economy. You have all this difficulty to distinguish one from the other. Regarding that topic of definition, there's also a very important debate about intentionality. So is environmental crime committed only if there's the intention to perpetrate this type of crime? And what about negligence? So if, I don't know, a serious harm is committed against the environment, but with that clear intention to do it, is it still a form of environmental crime? Yes or no? And you also have a very important debate about the role and the importance of intentionality in the way you define environmental crime, and with strong repercussions also on the legal framework. And what is very important to understand is how all this definitional work, all this discussion, they really relate to power struggles. It's because you have some more powerful actors that are able also to frame, to define environmental crime more than others, that you have this current definition of environmental crime. And that also echoes the role of companies, of private profits, who don't have any interest in extending the definition of environmental crime too much. Another type of difficulty, but that also relates to the first one, is about the enforcement, about green policing. So environmental crime is not a priority for police officers right now. This is clear. This is also due to the fact that this is a form of crime that has been seen as victimless. So there's not a lot of people who complain about it. So it seems that it's not that important. You have limited human and financial resources that are devoted to this form of crime. You also have not a lot of prestige that is associated to environmental crime in comparison with drug trafficking, in comparison with violence committed against human beings. So it seems that is something very secondary, and so that also perpetrates it is also a continuation of that type of vicious cycle. We don't have environmental crime, so we're not going to investigate on it. A second type of challenge is the lack of expertise and of knowledge of police officers. Environmental crime, this is something very technical. You need to be able to identify who are the protected spaces. Let's imagine you have 20 type of snakes that you found, which are the ones that are protected and should not be traded. This is the same with all the flora, for instance. So you have all this expertise that is required to identify, to detect that form of crime, and also a lack of knowledge about the frequency, about the type of victims, about the type of perpetrators of environmental crime. Thirdly, you have very difficult cooperation, international cooperation at first. So this is also due to the fact that you don't have a common definition of environmental crime. So it's difficult at first for police officers to work with other police officers coming from different countries if they don't have the same definition. It means also that they cannot use the same tools to investigate and detect that form of crime. You also have quite difficulties in regarding the cooperation of police officers with other national authorities, for instance, veterinary services that are also that are also involved in detecting that form of crime, for instance. That is also part of the difficulties of green policing. And what is quite interesting, and that is what I'm investigating in my current research project, is the way the national states rely on civil society and rely on NGOs to detect, to identify, to report environmental crimes. And you have that strong role of NGOs in green policing that you do not see that much in other forms of crime. Moving on to the second part of that presentation today. In comparison with other national or international actors, the EU appears as quite a latecomer on the topic. Since the 1990s, for instance, Interpol, so the International Police Organization, has developed many tools. They have developed some expertise on that topic. This is a little bit the same with the United Nations, for instance, and even with the Council of Europe. But the European Union, they were quite latecomer. Of course, that can be explained by the powers of the European Union, but still. After the Erika oil spill that I mentioned a little bit earlier today, the one that occurred in 1999, there has been an attempt from the European Commission to propose a directive on the protection of the environment through criminal law. What is quite striking is the way that member states were not willing at all to have the European Union intervening on this topic. And so instead of adopting the proposal from the European Commission, they went through another way, and they instead adopted a different type of tool that was proposed by a member state. It was proposed by Denmark. And so it was a framework decision. So maybe not all of you are familiar with that, but this is something quite legal. But this is not exactly the same type of tool, meaning that there was not exactly the same type of powers for the European institutions. And so it was the start of an institutional conflict between the European Commission and between the Council. And there was this key decision from the European Court of Justice in 2005 about that institutional conflict. So the Court of Justice of the European Union decided that, as a general rule, neither criminal law nor the rules of criminal procedure fall within the community's competence. So at first, it seemed that the European Commission was wrong in proposing that directive. And then this following part of the decision, the last mentioned finding does not prevent the community legislature, when the application of effective, proportionate, and dissuasive criminal penalties by the competent national authority is an essential measure for combating serious environmental offences, from taking measures which relate to the criminal law of the member states, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read it until the end. But there's like a change of paradigm. There's something very important here, and based on this decision, the European Commission came back with the second directive, the one that was adopted in 2008 about the protection of the environment through criminal law. So the idea is not to be very descriptive about the directive. I just want for you to understand the main objectives of this text. In this text, there's a specific list of violations, a specific list of environmental offences that are part of the protection through criminal law. For this specific list of violations, member states, they are required to criminalize them. They are required to adopt some effective, proportionate, and dissuasive criminal penalties. So there's a difference between criminal penalties here and civil penalties, meaning there's like this criminalization move. There's like something happening. Environmental crime is not just about civil administrative sanction, it is about criminal ones. And that's a big shift in the way you can approach environmental crime. So effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. So effective, it is about the way you can adopt a penalty and you ensure with the adoption of this penalty that the goal of protecting the environment is reached. This is about effectiveness. Dissuasiveness, it is about adopting sanctions in the way that the expected costs are higher than the expected benefits for the perpetrator. That the perpetrator has something to lose when they perpetrate that type of environmental offense. And finally, proportionality, it is about the higher the harm to environment is, the higher the sanction should be. So there's really this connection between the level of harm and the level of sanction. So I'm not going to give you much detail. That's not the point of today. What is very interesting is the fact that this text did not change a lot of things at the end. There was no unmuting of the victims of environmental crime this text. The first thing is that we still have a case of missing victim if we use the words of Paul Caldwell and the other scholars here, with the fact that at the same time that this directive was adopted, we had other tools such as the 1998 Convention of the Council of Europe, or some texts that have been adopted by the US that gave all its importance to victims. And this is not the case in this text. Victims are not mentioned. Civil society is not mentioned. The second problem with that text is the lack of clarity. There's clearly some vagueness in the definition of what is an environmental crime per itself. And that creates strong issues regarding the legality principle. How can you prosecute? How can you investigate on something you're not pretty clear about what it is? And that's a key principle also in criminal law. Thirdly, there has been a lot of issues regarding the implementation. There was this idea of approximating national legislation, but this was not the case. This also relates to the fact that you don't have sufficient clarity in the definitions. You have a lot of margin of maneuver that is granted to the member states. So member states just kept doing what they were doing before. Nothing changed with this text, and there was also nothing really to control what member states were doing. Especially if you remember what I just mentioned, how do you control that you have effective, proportionate, and distributive measures? How do you identify that? That's a very strong problem in that case. You don't have a definition, so you have a lot of space that is granted for interpretation. And finally, this is quite limited regarding the ambition of this text. You have a lot of environmental offenses that are not parts of this text, that are not covered by the list I just mentioned. You have a limited number of obligations for member states that can also be explained by the fact that you did not have yet the Lisbon Treaty, so you did not have yet all the powers granted to the European Commission to approximate national legislation, but still, there's a lack of ambition, and civil society, NGOs, MEPs, they have been very critical towards that text. The context changed a little bit in the recent years. There has been a strong impulse to tackle environmental crime at the EU level. So, some examples here: environmental crime is now a priority of the multi-annual cycles to tackle organized crime. So, for 4 years now, it has become one of the priorities. You also have Europol, the European Union agency in charge of cooperation between law officers, and Eurojust, the European agency in charge of judicial cooperation in civil and criminal matters, which have developed new tools. They have developed new strategies regarding environmental crime. They have, for instance, in Europol, you now have a report that is specific to this form of crime. You have a number of operations and investigations that have been launched to fight environmental crime. So you have a mobilization of different EU actors and institutions. In addition, you have you can see how many different soft law instruments have been developed by the European Commission. So especially through funding, that's something very important for the European Commission. That power. So, for instance, they have developed a lot of different live projects. They are called that put together practitioners from different member states with NGOs, with civil society, to also think in a collective manner on the good practices in fighting environmental crime. A lot of different recommendations also that have been developed by the European Commission. And everything that I just mentioned is also part of the Green Deal agenda of the European Commission. So that's what makes sense also of this new impulse from the European Union. There has been a new initiative that has been proposed by the European Commission, and what is interesting in it is that the European Commission really justified that new directive by a very critical perspective on what it has done before. So if you have a look at this text, at the way it is justified, this new directive, this is because it was not, the first one was not good enough. It was not implemented in a way good enough. So the new directive, the goal is clear. It's to add precision, legal certainty, and to provide more effectiveness in the fight against environmental crime. So different things that have been adopted. Once again, I'm not. The idea is not to have a very legal perspective. On the contrary, but there has been some changes that are quite important. So you have an extension of the categories of what is a criminal offense. So, for instance, you have things about illegal lodging here. You've got things about illegal fishing too. While the first list it was quite limited. It was about nine types of violation. Now it's a little bit more exhaustive, but still contested by a certain number of members of the civil society and NGOs. You also have this willingness from the European Commission to clarify some legal terms to specify that the main sanctions that should be used are jail time and fines, but you still have some possibilities for member states to interpret it with their own words. You have new obligations for member states regarding law enforcement, so something that was not mentioned at all before in the first text in 2008. Now you have this obligation to train law enforcement. You have the obligation to set up a national strategy. You have also a lot of different complementary soft law tools that have been used to provide this type of change regarding police. And finally, and I think, Chloé, you will be the one giving more details about that, the fact that you have also new measures to support civil society to protect the whistleblowers, the ones who report that type of crime, to also ensure that these people are able to participate to some extent to judicial proceedings. So that's also quite a big change. Right now, this text is being negotiated by the European Parliament and by the Council. So we don't know how it will look at the end. What we know for the moment is that the European Parliament and the Council are not on the same line at all. Not very surprising. The Council has been very active in diminishing, for instance, the list of environmental offences. They have tried also to give more leeway to the member states to interpret the text. And in the European Parliament, you had quite strong positions about, for instance, the level of fines, or how we can have proportionate and dissuasive fines for companies, for instance. The European Parliament, there was also this idea of adding the ecocide offense in the list of the environmental crime. That's also something maybe we'll talk about. And with this idea that it's something massive that does not need the same level of legal framework. So it's a little bit different from the other, where you have some specific legal texts that are in reference. Ecocide is a little bit different here. There's also some key question about the extension of the European Public Prosecutor's Office regarding environmental crime. So is it something that is necessary to enforce the implementation of that text? Another question is also, is there a need for approximation? If you have a look at soft law measures, the way soft law measures have led to some types of changes over time. And if you think about the strong resistance from member states to any approximation of criminal law, so that's also another debate. And finally, something that I find very interesting is criminal law the solution? And you have some scholars, you have some authors that came up with, maybe we should put an end to this punitive turn in societies, and we could think about different ways also to sanction the perpetrators of environmental crime. It could be, for instance, in form of obligation for polluting companies to become green ones. So that's a type of a forced conversion. That's also an idea that has been launched by some scholars. So I will stop here to ensure that we have enough time for Chloé and for Amandine. And once again, that's a lot of different open questions. Maybe some of you will be interested in that.
Thank you, Agathe.